Hello. Today I will be covering the chapter on eclectic theater and avant-garde theater. Let's first start with a little bit of historical context. It's the 1950s and World War II has just ended. Women now have a much bigger role in the world and are much more independent due to the fact that they were the ones who ran the factories and the offices while the soldiers were gone. The soldiers who came back from the war also brought with them many new ideas from their experiences. Technology was also going through radical changes. TVs were now more and more commonplace by the late 50s and early 60s. Rock and roll and hip hop were also becoming popular by the 70s and 80s. One of the major ideas from the 50s that emerged as a result of all of this was postmodernism. One of the key characteristics of postmodernism is how it doubted objective truths and accepted subjective truths. This idea of postmodernism also bled into theater. Theater was now including parody, satire, self-reference, as well as political and social points. Avant-garde theater was also gaining success in this time. One of the first forms to come out of this was absurdism. The characteristic of absurdist plays was that it abandoned any causality. Rather, stories were circular, or focused on just a minuscule event. It was often quite puzzling to critics and audiences, but it had great influence on future playwrights such as Harold Pinter. Street theater and guerrilla theater also came about, and they were the earliest forms of political and social theater. Theater that was used to make a point and talk about a social issue. Street and guerrilla theater were nowhere near formal. They often performed on the streets or even in department stores, wherever people could see them. One of the most important theaters of this avant-garde time was Julian Beck and Judith Malina's Living Theater. Founded in 1947, it soon became a full-on political theater. By the 60s, the theater was a, quote, benevolent anarchy of sorts, with its shows morphing into full-on protest marches. Audience participation was very high. However, by the 80s, as revolution thoughts died out, so did the prominence of living theater. Other social and political theaters also popped up in this era. For example, the Black Theater rose to prominence in the late 50s with Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun. The play focused on African American family life as well as tensions. Jean Genet's The Blacks revealed the abuses of white power throughout history. Further racial turmoil of the 1950s and 1960s led to a growth in the Black theater, which demanded change. Black theater shows focused on racial barriers, suffering, oppression, and racism. By the 80s, though, black playwrights were moving more into the mainstream. Another powerful theater movement was women's theater, which grew in the 70s. They promoted goals of feminism as well as the careers of female artists. Women's theaters showed up everywhere: New York City, Montana, Greenville. The women of this theater felt that they could use theater to correct the inequalities they were facing. Gay and lesbian theater also became prominent in the 1970s. The Glines Theater, opened by John Glines in 1976, was dedicated to making plays about homosexuals. These plays became more and more mainstream throughout the 80s, especially as the AIDS epidemic grew. Finally, another product of the avant-garde era was Joseph Chaikin's open theater. Rather than try to push any political or social message across, the open theater focused on changing the art of theater. This theater taught actors to work as a group, not as individuals. Group dynamic was developed through use of improvisation and theater games. Another interesting characteristic of the open theater was that actors would sometimes become their environment. For example, an actor may play a sheep or a snake, or several actors may play a siren. Avant-garde was strong from the 50s through the 80s, but eventually died out as people's hunger for revolution died out. Still, its influence remains. From all of the major movements that happened, there was now a much greater freedom of language and content in plays. African, Hispanic, openly homosexual, and female playwrights were finally being properly recognized as well. Thank you.